All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and look at the first lecture of our section here, and we're going to look at the cell membrane and what its function is for the cell, what it does, as well as the different components of the cell membrane. So if we go ahead and look, first off, every single cell, whether it's prokaryote, eukaryote, plant, or animal cell, every single cell has a cell membrane to it. It's almost like the skin of the cell. And what its roles are, what it does for the cell, is it, one, controls what comes in and what goes out of the cell. And it's also going to provide a lot of protection and support to the cell. Okay, so it's going to allow certain things to come in, certain things to leave. It's going to provide support and shape and protection to that cell and all of the organelles within the cell. Now, as far as the cell membrane goes, there's three major components to the cell membrane. The first one is what we call the lipid bilayer. So the lipid bilayer consists of phospholipids, and just like it sounds, these are lipids. Think about last chapter when we talked about lipids. Those are going to be some fats. Now, that lipid bilayer is what we call being selectively permeable. Okay, selectively permeable means that it is selective on what is allowed to come in and what is allowed to go out. So it's kind of picky and selective on what is allowed to cross the cell membrane. So the phospholipids are kind of the most major component of the cell membrane and is going to decide what is going to enter and what is going to exit the cell. The second main component are the proteins. Now, proteins can go ahead and be on the outside layer of the cell or the inside layer of the cell, or they actually might go all the way through the cell membrane. So there's different variations and types of proteins, but realistically, all of them have to do with moving materials across the cell membrane. So if something isn't going to easily go through the lipid bilayer, it might be able to use a protein to help move itself into the cell or out of the cell. Now, the third component are the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates go ahead and work almost like as an ID tag to the cell. It helps cells identify other cells and make sure that it's nothing foreign that shouldn't be there. And if it is identified as being foreign, we want to make sure that the immune system cells are going to go ahead and start to attack that so that we don't get sick. So carbohydrates, they are typically things that attach to either the phospholipids or the proteins on the outside of the cell, and they go ahead and they kind of look like little ID tags that stick out of the cell membrane. And again, they just go ahead and help identify different cells around each other. Now, the lipid bilayer, let's go ahead and look at that a little bit more, since the lipid bilayer is a lot of the components of the cell membrane itself. So bilayer means that it's double layered. The prefix bi means two. So it means it's a double layered sheet of phospholipids. Okay. Now, if we look at just one phospholipid, there's two sections of a phospholipid. There is the top head portion here that we're looking at. Okay, this portion of the phospholipid likes to be near water, which we refer to as being hydrophilic. Okay, hydro or hydra usually means water. Okay, philic means loving. So hydrophilic loves water. So this head portion of the lipid really likes to be near water. Now, the second half of the phospholipid, there's two tails that come off of the head. Those tails don't like to be near water, so they are called hydrophobic. So if you have a phobia, you're scared of something. So hydrophobic, you're scared of water. You don't like to be near water. So what happens is those two layers, when they go ahead and layer together to make a cell membrane, you'll always notice that the head portion is facing towards the inside of the cell or the outside of the cell, because that's going to be near water. And the tail portion, that's always going to be facing each other towards the inside of the phospholipids so that they stay away from water. Okay, so phospholipids have two areas: hydrophilic, loving water, that head portion, and hydrophobic, the tail portion, where they don't like water. And that's what really causes them to go ahead and form that bilayer sheet. Now, when we look at that lipid bilayer, okay, the outside of the cell is mainly going to be a water or aqueous environment. The inside of the cell is also going to be a water-like environment. So when we look at how those phospholipids arrange themselves, again, the head portions you'll notice of the phospholipids are always on the outside as well as always facing the inside of the cell because they are near water and they love water. Okay, the tail portions face themselves towards the inside so that they are away from the water as much as possible. Now, as far as what the membrane does, the whole role of the membrane, again, is to allow things to come into the cell and allow things to leave. Just like how any other organism needs to take things in, a cell is the smallest version of a living organism, okay? It needs to get nutrients in, but it also needs to let waste out. So the cell membrane is going to allow that to happen. Some things can get in very easily, where others have a little bit more of a difficult time. And again, that's where we call the cell membrane either being selectively permeable or semi-permeable. Some can get in and some cannot. Okay, if we look at the image here, we'll see that some of these smaller molecules, they're going to be able to cross over the cell membrane, whereas other ones aren't able to cross the cell membrane. They're not able to get across, okay? And that's where we talk about that cell membrane being semi-permeable. Some things can, some things can't cross. Now, as far as what the cell membrane does, a lot of times when we look at the size of the molecule, that's going to determine how easily it can cross the membrane. So smaller molecules, things like water, oxygen, they have a really easy time passing through that phospholipid bilayer. Okay, they have no problem either getting into the cell or getting out of the cell. However, when we have larger molecules like big sugars, okay, or any other larger type molecule, sometimes it has a harder time getting through that phospholipid bilayer. This is where we might have to go ahead and use a protein to help move it across, or we might have to go through some other type of transport that uses some energy, or some other options that we're going to look at later in the chapter. Okay, so typically very small molecules move very easily through that membrane, whereas larger molecules typically have a little bit more difficult time getting through that membrane, and we might have to look at some other routes of how to get them in or out. Okay, which again, we'll go ahead and talk about later in the chapter. Otherwise, that kind of finishes up what the membrane does and what its different components are. And next, we're going to go ahead and move into making a membrane with some candy.